Today I'm going to transform these old stackable file cabinets that I bought from Facebook Marketplace for $15 into beautiful and modern nightstands. So let's get started. Step 1 was to clean the file cabinets by using Goo Gone and a razor blade to scrape off the insane amount of tape that were covering these cabinets. You can see it easily came off, but also a lot of really gross dirt and grime came off too. So I took them outside for a deep clean. But first I opened them up and I found a photo negative, which I hadn't seen in a really long time, and my kids had actually never seen one before. They thought it was really cool, made me feel really old. Anyways, back to the cleaning. I used Krud Kutter and a Bristle Brush to really scrub the dirt and nastiness off of these file cabinets. It's one of my favorite cleaning products to use whenever I'm prepping a piece of furniture for paint. I then grabbed my hose, sprayed off all the remaining soap and Krud Kutter, and let them air dry. Next step was to shave off the little tab on the cabinet's top that made them a stackable file cabinet. We want a really flat, smooth surface for a nightstand, so it had to go. I grabbed one of my most underrated tools in my garage, my Dremel, with a metal cutting attachment. If you're planning to do a lot of furniture, this is a must-have tool and it's pretty inexpensive. I'll link mine in the notes below. I should have clamped the cabinet to my work table to make it easier, but hey, it still worked and gave a nice smooth cut. So once it was off, I needed to smooth out the surface of all the holes and scratches. So I grabbed Bondo putty, which works really good on metal. It's a pretty easy two-step application process. First, you just need something to mix it on. I usually grab just an old Amazon box and a putty knife. I scoop some of the Bondo mixture out, add a small amount of the hardener. I recommend reading the instructions to determine how much you need, and then mix it up and scrape it on, really pushing down into those crevices. Then you let it dry. It only takes about 15 to 20 minutes and it's time to sand it off. I use my Orbital Sander and 100 Grit Sandpaper to sand the Bondo mixture off until it's a smooth surface. While I was sanding, I decided to grab the other parts of the cabinet and give those a light scuff sand to ensure that the paint would adhere to those as well. After I started sanding the second file cabinet, I realized that one of the holes was not completely filled with Bondo. So I went, grabbed the Bondo, mixed up a little bit more, and filled up that hole so that it would be a really nice smooth surface and not a divot. After the Bondo dried, I sanded off until smooth, and then it was time to prime. I used an Automotive primer, which is a fantastic primer to use on metal. It really helps the paint stick. And I gave a nice light spray to all of the surfaces on the file cabinets. After the primer dried, I used Rust-Oleum's white spray paint and sprayed the cabinets and drawers. I didn't film spraying the drawers, but I sprayed the top, bottom, and inside. After the paint dried, I took the drawers inside to paint the hardware. I couldn't figure out how to remove the hardware to spray paint them, so instead I took some of the Rub and Buff and a gold leaf color and just used a small paintbrush and painted it on. It's super easy to use and I actually really like how it turned out. Now that the cabinets were fully finished, I moved on to building the base of the nightstands. I will share all the supplies that I used in the notes below, but first up was to cut the shelf that the cabinet would sit on. The cabinets don't look done here, and it's because I went ahead and cut these while I was waiting on some stuff to dry and didn't want to jump around in this video and confuse you. To cut the shelf, I put the cabinet on the wood, traced it, and used my circular saw to make the cut. Next up were the table legs. I used my miter saw to make the cuts and used one of the legs as a template to ensure that they were all the same size. I wanted the design of the nightstands to have a small taper to the front two legs at the bottom to give a little more dimension, so I set my miter saw at 5 degrees and made the cut. It's such a small cut that it probably wasn't necessary, but I chose to do it regardless. It was time to attach the legs to the bottom shelf, so I grabbed my Kreg pocket hole tool and made pocket holes on 2 sides of the legs. I wanted to ensure it was secured, so I drilled 2, and I added a little bit of wood glue for good measure. So I did this on all 4 of the table legs before moving on to the next part, which was filling those pocket holes with a pocket hole filler to make them seem like there's no holes there at all and a super seamless design. Attach them by taking a little bit of wood glue, putting them on the wood, and sticking them in the holes. Super simple. So finally it was time to build the bottom shelf. I followed the same process as the top shelf, outlining my cabinet and cutting with a circular saw. So to save on cost, I used a thin sheet of plywood And the next step I will show you will be to edge those sides of the plywood so it looks like wood and not a sheet of plywood. This step is actually really easy. So first you measure the edging to size and cut using scissors. Veneer is just a very thin sheet of wood, and most of it has glue on the back that you have to heat up to get it to stick to whatever surface you're trying to adhere it to. So I just used an iron to evenly iron it on to this plywood. I then used a J-roller to evenly apply pressure to make sure the veneer sticks, but it's not necessary. You could do it by just running your hands over it or just using like a plastic rounded putty knife, just something to ensure even pressure. Then I just used 220 grit sandpaper to sand at a 45-degree angle to help remove that excess veneer, and then a razor blade to cut the rest off. Afterwards, I needed to cut the corners out of the shelf so that the table legs would slide into that bottom shelf really easily. I used some extra table leg wood that I had and traced around each of the edges and used a jigsaw to make those cuts. To attach the shelf to the legs, I measured where the shelf would be on each of those legs and used a small piece of extra wood. I applied some wood glue and used a wood clamp to help it adhere. I should have also used a level to make sure that it was nice and straight. I didn't do that, but luckily it worked out in the end. Once it was dry, I used my brad nailer to secure the shelf to the piece of wood. I did this on all 4 of the legs and then clamped them using a level to ensure everything was flat. It was time to stain the wood, and I decided to go with a light natural cork gel stain by Lilly. Using a gel stain on pine wood is the way to go because pine tends to get really blotchy with an oil-based penetrating stain. I used a foam brush to apply the stain and wiped off any excess with a lint-free cloth. And we are finally at the last step where I used liquid nails to apply the cabinet to the top of the base I had just built and stained. I applied the liquid nails approximately 2 inches from the edges so that it wouldn't spill over whenever I put the cabinet on top. I then placed a towel over the cabinet so the clamps wouldn't damage the paint finish on that cabinet. And then I clamped the cabinet to the base wood and let it sit for about 24 hours while the liquid nails dried. And the cabinets were finally finished. I was so proud of this first build. It's not perfect, but hey, neither am I. I didn't record this step, but I also applied some peel and stick wallpaper to a piece of cardboard to make the file cabinet drawer nice and flat so little things wouldn't get lost in those crevices. And it adds a fun pop of color. I'd love if you told me in the comments if this was helpful or what I could do better for my future YouTube videos. Thank you so much for watching.